We're joined by Los Angeles Times immigration reporter Molly OToole. She is in Washington. Molly, good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
So we saw Secretary Nielsen at the border with President Trump as recently as this past Friday. Just explain the timing of her departure. What changed so quickly just over the weekend?
Well, it was interesting seeing Nielsen at the border with the president. Actually, the last time they were supposed to go to the border together, which is the Texas border, around the end of last year, the trip was canceled because the president had told people that he had planned on firing Nielsen, and then she had held on for a few more months. In those intervening months, they've really seen a spike in the numbers of Central American families primarily arriving at the border. Now, it should be noted there tends to be a seasonal uptick in the spring, but we've seen some very large numbers. They were planning on announcing this morning, I believe, the March numbers, which they expected to reach above 90,000, close to 100,000 for the month, which would be really quite a high number within the last few decades. And so this is sort of the context. The president has set up his aides to sort of implement these political promises he's made to shut down the border, to block asylum seekers, although they have a legal right to claim asylum once they arrive on U.S. soil. He sort of set them up to fail in some ways with these very difficult to achieve promises based on, bureaucratic obstacles or even U.S. law. And Nielsen found herself in this position of sort of perpetually disappointing the president because these numbers continued to go up. This is the reality of the situation at the border, and probably has to do to a large degree with what seems like a swift change this weekend, but really was a continuation of a pattern between Nielsen and the president. And
as you know, Molly, Secretary Nielsen oversaw the controversial zero-tolerance policy that ultimately separated more than 2,700 children from their parents. How else will her legacy be defined?
Well, so in many ways, if we look at the pattern between the president and Nielsen, as we've said, where she was berated in cabinet meetings, he was clearly not pleased with her performance, or at least these numbers continuing to rise. And we saw her sort of repeatedly, really publicly defend some of the administration's most draconian deterrents to try and deter migration, whether it's family separation and zero tolerance. She was really one of the most vocal defenders of that policy. We also saw one of the most sweeping changes that's been sort of quiet in terms of public attention is this quote unquote, it's really remain in Mexico is how people often refer to it, not the technical name, which is turning around Central American asylum seekers at the border and having them wait in Mexico while their cases are adjudicated in the United States. And that's potentially one of the biggest changes to the U.S. asylum system that Nielsen really spearheaded and has defended. And that's been a couple hundred people so far, but they've talked about expanding it to the entirety of the border. And that'd be a really sweeping historic change for U.S. immigration policy.
We were just showing while you were talking, Molly, images of people trying to get across the border and, of course, understanding the legalities that are involved in securing the border here in the United States. You can just imagine what would lead someone to put themselves, their families, in the conditions that we've witnessed time and time again in the hopes for a better life and a better future here in the United States. So the president says, though, that he wants someone even tougher managing this whole process. So he has named the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Kevin McAneilan to be acting secretary. What more do we know about him?
Well, it's an interesting choice because he says he wants to go in a tougher direction, and that would lead you to believe that potentially he wants someone in charge who's really an immigration hardliner. McAleenan, it's not necessarily that. He's served in several positions, but he's been with Customs and Border Protection for some time. He is really sort of a trusted career official. You don't hear the kind of rhetoric that it seems the president wants on immigration coming out of his mouth. In recent testimony, for example, and this is just an example of the sort of whiplash between the president and some of his top aides on these issues. He emphasized that if you want to prevent Central American migration coming north through Mexico to the United States, you really have to target it at its source, that there has to be more support for Central American governments to provide the kind of resources that potentially might prevent people from fleeing sort of record levels of violence that we're seeing in the Northern Triangle in particular, some of the highest levels of homicides outside a war zone, government corruption, poverty, and so on. So he talked about targeting the push factors in Central American countries. And as we know, the president threatening to cut aid, and the State Department confirming that they'd be pursuing that route for cutting aid to Central America. So the proposed nomination, or at least in an acting capacity, sorry, not the official nomination, but naming McLeenan to be head of DHS is an interesting choice because he doesn't quite fit that mold that it seems the president says that he wants. So we'll see what happens next there. We will indeed. Molly, thank you so much. Molly OToole for the Los Angeles Times there in our D.C. bureau. We appreciate it. Thanks.